From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. The second in our Corcoran intern talks at the end of the year. This one is Julie Garcia, who's been working with the Artist Book Collection, specifically looking for artistic responses or reflections of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. It's not the topic that Julie originally started with. What were you starting with originally?
Well, I was originally looking at artist responses to death, kind of very broadly.
So we narrowed it down. But what she uncovered was, in fact, a fairly rich gathering of materials, since one of the collecting strategies for the Library of Congress after 9/11 was to have all of the special collections attempt to collect reactions to 9/11 in their genre or in their field. So for the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, that meant that we went after artist book representations of the event. This is very bittersweet because this is the end of our I wish I had 5 more in the room so we could keep this going. So as much as I want to introduce her to have her come up and give her talk, I'm delaying just so we can hang on to her just for a couple more minutes. But I don't think it's going to happen. Very nice to have her family here, especially her gorgeous daughter. And I think without any further more muck, I'm going to introduce Julie, who will give you an overview of the 9/11 Artist Book Collection.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming this afternoon to see really just a small sampling of the artist books that are in the collection here, and to hear my thoughts on what makes these books stand out in a collection of really special books that Mark has put together in the Rare Books collection here at the Library of Congress. There are 1,000 ways that somebody could parse or categorize the books in this collection. As a Corcoran intern, I was in the enviable position of being able to look through all of the books and with a little guidance determine a topic of greatest interest to me and then just look at those books. And as Mark said, I actually, my first topic was actually Islamic bindings. And then I moved from there to this idea of looking at artists' responses to death for a couple of reasons, and then from there actually narrowed it down to books that were inspired or motivated by the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And this area is something that's it's really different for me, both in the types of art that I'm normally attracted to and books that I'm normally attracted to. So I was able to learn a lot, both about the artistic process and also about the specific books that I investigated, which some of which are here. Just a little teaser so you don't have to keep looking at that opening slide. I did also focus on a certain type of artist book, typically ones that included both images and text, or had images that served in place of text or vice versa. So I excluded books that were purely photographic, of which there are many, in some of the different special collections, books that were only poetry or that were just diary writings with no accompanying images, suites of prints, comic strips, and with one exception, I excluded mass-produced multiples. And actually, Mark's sitting right next to that book, and I'll talk about it at more length later. So the group of books I started with was self-selected. It was a little smaller than what the library has. There were about 40 of those, and then I further winnowed that down, really just based on the books that I liked best, the ones that stayed with me, the ones that stayed in my head when I went home at night, the ones that I couldn't stop thinking about or I wished that I had made. And again, here they are all together. So one of the things that I was able to do this semester was to reflect on the purpose of artist books and why in particular so many artists did choose to respond to the events of 9/11. I think one of the hopes of any artist is to connect with an audience, whether they make high art or low art, to make it accessible, to more people than it would otherwise reach. So the choice of a book artist to address a topic like the attacks of 9/11 that are so well documented in so many forms of media, it helps in that it's accessible, people know about it, but it also creates an element of risk for the artist because people really approach the subject with a lot of preconceived thoughts and notions and beliefs about it. So nearly everybody over a certain age in America, not everyone in this room because my daughter is very young, but whether they were in New York or in DC or just anywhere in the world watching the events unfold on TV or listening on the radio, people felt like they were part of that day. And so the question I was grappling with is how do book artists express tragedy through art in a way that's meaningful, in a way that other people can access. So an artist book really is a unique expression of this type of collective experience that many people share and to which people bring personal insight. Reading a book is a tactile experience. It's a private thing, but the artists can bring their experience to the individual's level. So it allows the reader to share in the artist perspective of the collective experience very personally, and then to interact on more than one level, as you'll see in a lot of these books, with the material that's in the book. Also very interesting for me as I was looking at the books is the fact that since all of the books address the same subject matter, it gave me, as a student, a good basis for comparison among the books. So it's quite easy when you're looking at these books to get caught up in their emotional impact. It was important for me to be able to assess and evaluate them based on the content and the craft of the book themselves, not on the emotional and psychological impact of the events that they represented. And so I believe that the most successful artist books on this topic addressed one element of the attacks, and then they used that element or aspect to really open the door to a thoughtful exploration of the events of the day and of its repercussions. So these are the books that they pique the reader's interest and they invite him or her in for further reflection and contemplation. They evoke the events of the day, but they also evoke more complicated internal responses. And the books I think that were the most effective also provide more of a psychological closure. So even just from the experience of reading the book, if not for the events themselves. There were also some common threads that ran through many of the books, which I will quickly highlight before we get into actually looking at the books, and then we'll point out and maybe even point to some of the books that show those themes, and then discuss how they're used most effectively throughout the books that I looked at. The physical structure of the books is one very obvious way that a lot of book artists conjured up the events of 9/11. We see a desire to recreate the towers themselves in the shape and the form of the books. You also see that in the materials that were used and the images that were used, in the content of the books. In the terms of the physicality of the books themselves, there are a lot of references, both direct and indirect, to loose pages fluttering about. You can see the display. They've actually fluttered out of the way that I've put them up already. In one book here called Collective Memory, there are references to dust particles, to an overwhelming sense of grayness, and then, of course, to the towers themselves, one example being right here. Closely related to that is the idea of reconstruction and of gathering. Many of these books demonstrate a very obvious desire to gather and to rebuild, to collect pieces either from the site or to memorialize events from the site in physical form. There's a gathering of information, there's a gathering of physical evidence from the day. A number of books that I won't discuss and that unfortunately did not have room to display are actually printed on paper, made from detritus collected from around the site. And many books that are on display include collections of names and photographs from the day. The element of time is it's actually very interesting to see as it evolves in these books in a couple of different ways. There's differences in the responses that were more immediate, and in the books that were published years, sometimes as much as 10 years after the event. Now in the scope of history, 10 years is not that much time, but the books that were published in the first few weeks and months after the events really have a rawness about them and an immediateness that is not apparent in some of the later books. It's also interesting to note the changes that take place in books for artists that began the work right after the events, but then continued to work on their books for several years, or put the work aside and came back to it after several years to complete it, and then the changes that they made over the course of those years. And then the next thing to look at is the continuum from the literal to the conceptual in the way the topic is addressed. The place where each book lands on that continuum very much affects its impact. Some artists were very literal in their depiction of events, describing in narrative and in photographs minute-by-minute chaos and aftermath of what was happening. Others approached the topic much more indirectly, either choosing one aspect of the event or that period of time that haunted them or that inspired them artistically. Some of the books were so indirect as to be opaque and not make any personal connection for me, so I didn't include those books, in the topic. The final idea that I think was a common theme among these books is the idea of the late 20th century artist book. And this is something we spend a lot of time considering in our graduate school classes. What would be the definition of this? What are the components of this? And there is an argument to be made that I will make that this genre really does epitomize the late 20th century artist book movements. These books have a social conscience. Some of them have a very direct political message. Others are more really just books of mourning and reflection. But at their strongest, these books represent a desire to memorialize a universal experience, for the most part, without crossing the line into too much sentimentality. They provide a personal and a collective catharsis, and they're a document or a relic to commemorate an important event in U.S. history. As is always the case, some books achieve greater success than others, and so we're here to examine a small selection of these books and to consider whether I think they've accomplished that purpose. So I'm going to start by showing you what I experience as the difference between a book that is really merely descriptive as opposed to one that opens up space for new ways of thinking about a collective experience. This is a book called Hecatomb, and it's on display over on, I guess that's your right. This book was published in 2007 by Maria Pisano in an attempt to come to terms with an experience that is a constant open wound for the nation. So this book is really, it's a memorial. It's intended to be a memorial, and it's a beautifully crafted one. The book is housed in a box that resembles a tower or a coffin, harkening back to the themes of gathering and to the physicality. The box is laser stenciled. It creates a feeling of a void or a place where something once was. The internal structure of the book is the super complicated triple accordion. It's two towers connected by a wall of photographic images, and you can see it here. This shows the accordion structure. It's a powerful monument to the memory and events of the day. Certainly causes us to cast our memory back, to reflect on the events, the heroes of the day, and the other images and photographs that are burned into our minds. But I think, as you can perhaps see from this final slide, it's a very literal retelling of the events. It doesn't seek to expand our thought in any way. The two side panels are the list of names of the victims, and then the center section links the two towers with the photos of the day and the aftermath. So this book pulls very powerfully on your emotions. It's gorgeously crafted. It's a fitting memorial, but I think it also demonstrates the concept of how certain books make a more provocative as opposed to a literal or narratively descriptive impression. So I'm going to share one more book that is literal and was made almost immediately after the attacks. It attempts to bring the readers right into the vortex of the events of September 11th, and it's Marshall Weber's book called 11. It's a digitally printed volume. It's bound in black velvet. It's sitting right next to Mark on the table to your left. It appears to be a standard codex, but the pages have alternating vertical and horizontal orientation. Some of them are completely upside down. So it requires you to turn the book up to 180 degrees with each turn of the page. And I'm not sure if this slide really captures that, but there's a silhouette of the Twin Towers on what's intended to be the right-hand corner of each page to let the reader know what the orientation of that page should be. So it's a purposeful reorientation or disorientation for the reader. And when this book was initially exhibited, it was placed on a turntable, so that the reader could, you would go up and you would just turn the turntable around so that people were not, actually flipping the book and flipping the pages. So the reader has to really actively participate with the book and manipulate it in a way that, for me, it actually became somewhat distressing. That's intentional. It's designed to reflect feelings, the responses of the day, feelings of confusion and disassociation with reality, while trying to keep you engaged with the images and the text. For me, the constant need to reorient, it created actually sort of a visceral discomfort. It got in the way of my ability to appreciate the content of this book. So I felt it wasn't really able to transcend the images and help me move forward with any feelings of solace or reflection. This book actually left me feeling a little panicky, but you can see how it makes you feel if you'd like to take a look at it. This book was created in 2001, published in 2002, so perhaps the immediacy, of that impacted the overall, ambiance of the book, and it might be that the purpose of this book is to transport people back to the days immediately after 9/11 to provide insight into what that felt like, and if that's the case, then I think it does achieve its purpose. But using my self-imposed criteria from earlier, that book does not give me space for reflection or any closure after viewing it that I would like to have. I did examine some other books that created other types of interactive experiences that I actually found, energizing or cathartic, or even contemplative or peaceful. And I think that was a much more appealing experience to me. This first one, called Even the Birds Are on Fire by Sarah Parkow. It's a beautiful little book. It's on the back table. It uses vertical and horizontal streams of text reflecting two different voices, with the vertical streams giving a timeline of events, and then the horizontal text just being different poems and comments about the day. The materials used in the book are very light and simple. The book really provides a meditative focus of sharing and of compassion for the deceased and for their loved ones, which is particularly reflected in a second version of the book, which is called the prayer flag version, which is also displayed on the back table. You can see that the materials here are very light and airy. Of course, again, there's the theme of fluttering and things floating in the wind, but you pick that up even in the standard version of the book, the one that isn't literally fluttering in the wind like this one is. So if you want your memorial to provide you some sense of closure and peace, a book like this one is much more effective because it brings you back to the events of the day but it doesn't like throw you into the eye of the hurricane like Marshall Weber's 11 does. Another work that aligns very closely with the themes of the paper fluttering in the wind and the physicality of the response, as well as social consciousness, is a work called T1 and T2, which is, again, over on your right. It was made by 2 continuing education classes at the New York School for Visual Arts under the direction of artist and teacher Andrew Castrucci. The pages are encased in coffins or towers. The pages were left loose intentionally to represent how the air was littered with falling paper and debris. And in part of the colophon, they specifically mention that. There are literally hundreds of sheets, individual sheets in each of these books. I have some images from the first and second book. Here, each image is very different. Some of them are multi-layered. And as you can see, the class worked with a very limited set of materials and color palette. So it's very sobering to sit with that collection of materials and to page through the books to see the incredible variety of response from so many artists and people living in New York at the time. The sheer volume of it actually creates its own bit of psychological space for the reader, which itself provides a very moving memorial. So one of the most well-known books created after 9/11 is a book called Out of the Sky by Werner Pfeiffer. I'm sure you can't help but have noticed it. It's the 6-foot-tall set of towers right next to me with the woodcuts leading into typography at the top. This book is so loaded with themes and with symbolism. I could but won't spend the rest of my talk here. This is what it looks like before it's open. The reader, of course, is invited to open the box that Pfeiffer has created, which stores the pieces of the tower, the architectural supports, and the textural material that he has included. So the box is like a vessel or an urn that houses all of the parts that Pfeiffer perceives as having collapsed from the top down, hence the title of his book. So, the planes came down, the towers came down, people came down, but also in the natural course of things, there's a cycle of building up and coming down and a returning to Earth. And I did leave one of the towers partially built so that you could see the architectural support and just the way that he created it and the way that one would build it, or he actually calls it reading the book. The middle section contains an essay, which is the textual portion. So it's really quite an experience to build these towers. You want to be obviously super careful as you're constructing them. You're thinking about it. You're looking at the woodcuts, and as you're doing that, you're realizing it's this precious, pointless symbol that you're, in the middle of the rare books room or you're in the Rosenwald room, building these giant cardboard replicas of the Twin Towers, and you're just going to have to take it apart and put it away. But as you're doing it and you're getting to the top and these people's names are there, and you want to honor them. You want to keep going. You want to build it. And so the construction of the towers is an important part of reading the book and having those thoughts. Equally as important, though, is the deconstruction of the towers and the putting away. And so what follows from that process is the ability to, first of all, the ability to take it down and to put it away, and to know that you can resurrect them again at will when you want to. For Pfeiffer, that was a very important part of the psychological healing after the attacks. In manipulating this book, we understand that everything comes down, things are decaying from the top down, but we can choose to be active participants in honoring that, in putting it away, and letting that help us heal, and in moving on. So when you first kind of see this book, or when you come to the library and you think, this is going to be so fun, I can build this tower, and it kind of is, but it's so much more than that. And the fact that it takes time to move through the process, and you're confronted with these images and with this list of names, it makes it's really a very solemn thing. And by the time you reach the final piece and the construction or the deconstruction, you really do feel like you have participated in a meaningful healing ritual. And then this is actually Werner Pfeiffer, and he, after he completed the edition of these books, he does travel around and talk about them and build the towers. So returning to the themes, this book really does have it all. It has literal elements, figural representations. It's obvious what this book is, yet we really can learn something new from it and bring our own thoughts to it as we manipulate it and as we read the text. There's reconstruction, there's building, there's gathering back together, which is soothing for the psyche. For some people, this could have religious overtones, the ability to resurrect. You have the physical towers, and then the great elements unique to the late 20th century artists' books, both in the subject matter, the dimensionality, and the meaningful, thought-provoking interactivity. So this is just a wonderful book. In kind of a similar vein, although the books physically couldn't be more different, I wanted to next take a look, and I'm sorry this is not a good picture, at a small white square volume by Mi Jin Yoon called Absence, and that one's on the other side of Mark. This is a solid white block of a book. It's about 4 inches square, 120 pages, and the text consists of die-cut holes and blocks that represent the Twin Towers, including their antenna masts. This is a book where there is no text, just the holes that remain constant until the last page when you see the bits of the tower in shambles on the ground. It's kind of like a ghost of a book, but it allows for quiet reflection, and it gives ample room for the viewer to bring his or her own thoughts. And so this is the antenna leading to the towers, the whole middle of the book, many, many pages, you just see the towers, and then this is what the end of the book looks like. So this book exemplifies absence, I think, in many ways. It's not just a really interesting use of negative space, but also there's the special use of the book form to magnify the sense of loss or of absence here. The very nature of the codex book structure, even while you're turning pages and beginning to understand what you're seeing and what's happening, you're being deprived of the full visual experience of seeing the towers because they're vanishing behind you as you turn the pages ahead of you to see more of them. Thus, the true meaning of absence. The book also speaks to the physical absence of the towers in a powerful and interactive way, but differently, obviously, from this book, because you get to the end of this book and you don't get any psychological benefit of reconstruction or gathering or any ability to put away or any kind of psychological soothing. You just kind of get to the end here, and you're kind of bereft. So you don't really get to follow your emotions through from start to finish in the process of manipulating the book like you do with Werner Pfeiffer's book. Absence really leaves the reader hanging and doesn't provide a self-contained mechanism to resolve the feelings of absence. So thus another way that the book exemplifies absence. A third piece that's really interactive and does provide some area to grieve and reflect, and yet a completely different way, is a piece called Collective Memory by an artist named Cheryl Oring. On the 10th anniversary of the attacks, she had a row of typists go to Bryant Park and take dictation on typewriters from anybody who wanted to answer the question, what would you like the world to remember about 9/11? And that is some of the responses are what is hanging up between the two lights, and many, many more responses are on a table in a box behind you. These typists typed the answers to the questions verbatim on 4x6 cards, Participants were then invited to add the rubber stamps you see in red and some in black on each card. So the initial level of interactivity here occurred in the making of this book, with the idea that the participants were, talking to a live person, a typist, which probably caused them to respond a little bit differently than they might if they were answering a questionnaire online, or not talking really face-to-face to another person. One of these typists wrote an article for a New York magazine after the fact in which she reported, "The act of inviting the telling was beautiful to me and as fitting a memorial as anything could be." So the responses were then collected and reproduced in the book format that you saw a minute ago. They've been displayed in a museum setting as pages, fluttering in the wind. I tried to recreate a little bit of that here. They're provided in a box with clips to hang them on. This book really captured my attention because of the collective nature of the response, the timing, and the execution of it. It was a gathering and collecting of ideas and thoughts and material, from a huge variety of sources. It happened at a significant point in relation to the event on the 10-year anniversary. It was a day that people were already in a reflective mood. Some people were actually at Bryant Park waiting for the typist to set up so they could share their thoughts. So the reader of this book actually gets their catharsis from sharing in and reading about the group catharsis of the activities that occurred in the park. And there's some sample responses here, but again, there's many around the room. Much like T1 and T2, just reading these comments is a very mixed experience because some of them will bring you to tears, very emotional. Some of the comments you won't agree with. Some of the remarks you might just find inappropriate to the circumstances. Some of them might give you, an aha moment, something you hadn't thought of before. But the idea of sitting down with that stack of cards and honoring the memories by going through and considering each one just creates a pause, a moment of contemplation that takes the reader beyond his or her own thoughts and memories about the day and provides just a huge variety of perspective. So it's truly a piece that inspires reflection, and it surfaces a lot of specific individual thought. So finally, I'm going to share 3 books that I thought really epitomized qualities of excellence in craftsmanship and captured the essence of the themes of late 20th century artist books. They moderated their approach. They weren't too literal as to be obvious. They weren't too obtuse as to be unapproachable. They were all tempered at least a little bit by the passage of time, and they all really allowed for psychological, if not a physical reconstruction, a gathering of thoughts and a processing of information about the events that I think provide for a little, some psychological healing. The first one, so here is more, that was a museum display of all the responses. So the first one of the next series is called Falling to Earth by Michael Kutch. And I'm just going to run through several slides of this book so you get a sense of it before I talk about it. It's a large format book. It's on the back table. It's a really luxurious volume, and you could see that the layout is very carefully thought out between the images and the text. All of the images are evocative of falling, floating, and flying. There's poetry there that doesn't caption the images, but it captures the same themes along with loss and salvation. I had the good fortune to be in contact with Michael Kutch, who created this work, and I discussed with him why he felt moved to commemorate this event. I talked with him a little bit about his creative process over time in making the work. So it was interesting because he initially intended to make a much more abstract work, only tangentially referencing 9/11, but he ultimately found his thoughts and his writing continually returning to this theme of falling, and you see that reflected in the angels and the parachutes, in his religious and mythological imagery, And so he explained to me that for him, that the making books allows him to pursue not only his love of words, but also to find a resolution for a theme like this that might sort of be plaguing him artistically. And so I think that is what helped this and then the next few books really stand out, because you can really see as you look through the book and read his writings that he does come to resolution, and he helps you come to resolution. The book offers a full cycle of emotions, and it brings you back to a better place than where you started. It doesn't sort of leave you in the midst of chaos or struggling with feelings of upset and despair. It gives you that psychological moment to come to some sort of peace with the subject matter and move on, which to me is an appealing thing in a book. So I think the next artist also does this extremely well, and the reader is able to see that happen in the collaboration between Ilse Schreiber-Knoll and the poet Galway Kinnell in this book that is based on his poem called When the Towers Fell. So these two had collaborated in the past, and then when she read his poem about the attacks, he gladly agreed to participate again in a book project. And he even wrote out by hand several stanzas of his poem that appear in the first volume of the book, which you can see here, which I think really adds to that. Once again, I had the benefit of some of Ms. Schreiber-Knoll's personal insights into the making of this book. She too had initially intended something very different. She wanted what she had called a clean book with simple woodcuts and text on beautiful paper. And she actually started making a book using that approach, and a remnant of that, can be seen here. But ultimately, she felt like this approach wasn't expressing the emotions that she wanted to convey and the emotions of the poem. So she started to include ashes and sand and other materials onto the painted surface of the page, and used woodcut and gauze on overlays. And this is a kind of a close-up of what she ended up with. So this work ends up being very powerful because the materials used really correspond to the range of emotions, from the very crisp and clean delivery of the words of the poem, which are made a little more raw and present with the handwritten element. But then you get this additional material that's very physical, it's very rough, it's incredibly tactile, yet it's also very natural, and it speaks to the cycle of evolution. So again, this is a book in which all the elements really come together, the text, the material choice, and this is, and you see the element of time, where the author let herself change her mind and go in a different direction, and it really resulted in a final work that feels complete and does express a full range of emotions. So this next book I have grown to truly love. I probably shouldn't have saved it for last, but I did, and nonetheless, here it is. It is called 9 Nights Meditation. The number 9 came to significance for the authors of this work because of the work of William Blake in illustrating the poet Edward Young's work 9 Thoughts. And I have both of these books out on this table over here, so you can compare and contrast them. 9 Thoughts is an epic poem set over 9 nights with contemplative thoughts on life, death, and immortality. The authors of this book, of 9 Nights, were also coincidentally aware of a Hindi festival of Navratri, which is a festival over 9 nights having to do with spiritual cleansing and enlightenment. I think those are things that many people were actually seeking in the aftermath of a tragedy like 9/11 that they can't understand. 9 Nights was also the length of time of the battle in the Ramayana between Rama and Ravana. So the authors felt a mystical ritual association with the number 9. And this, just to let you see a few of the interior pages of this book. This book is a great demonstration of the importance of time and how it can really change and benefit a book, not only in terms of the 9 nights and the significance that held for the authors as a transitional period of time and how that was very much on their mind, but because of the changes that did occur over time in the text of this book as the images were coming together. So the early textual references to literal events of 9/11 by Anne Waldman were replaced with allusions and references to things like night migrations and plate shifts and dark matter as she began to see the illustrations that Donna Dennis was sending her over a period of nearly 3 years that it took her to complete those. The artist, after 9/11, imagined looking for the light of the towers, which she used to be able to see from her home, which she could no longer see. But she imagined finding them through a telescope as a constellation in the night sky. And then she imagined finding other victims as other stars and other constellations. And she imagined the mound of metal that had been the towers eventually growing over with grass and wildflowers and having her telescope be on top of that. And that was sort of her, jumping off point for much of the artwork here. You know, she imagined her telescopes on top of this mound and it sort of began this poetic memorial. And then as she started sending her artwork to Anne, the words and the images began to work together, much better as Anne, changed the poetry. So the references are much more oblique, but they're apparent, and they offer, a genuine springboard for reflection, and these sort of smoky, smudgy, but somehow very peaceful images. Really, they beckon you and they draw you in, and it's worth looking at. And I think this book is so interesting because it is so not a book that I was initially attracted to, or the kind of book that I, would normally be attracted to, but it's like a Chinese watercolor, and then, like, the more you look at it, the more you see, and the images they just really do draw you in. And there's so much there. It's words that aren't captioning the images that are adding so much to the text without illustrating them. It was really just a remarkable collaboration between these two artists. So I guess it's not surprising that it took them 3 years to complete the work. And it strikes just the right balance on the continuum between the literal and the conceptual. It harkens back symbolically to the physicality of the towers and the night. So just letting the words and the images, ferment over time, I think just really worked to their advantage. And so, has it been meaningful to use art and artists' books as a medium to explore this tragedy? I think it has. Among the many benefits to my studies this semester was the opportunity to connect with a lot of the artists who created these works. And so they have been uniformly generous with their time and their insights. I mean, so many people I talk to, I haven't even been able to talk about their books, but you'll see books around the tables that I haven't mentioned, but they're all worth a look. It's helped me tremendously understand not only their creative process, my own creative process, the concept of inspiration, the social and psychological need for art, and for books. So Michael Cutt shared with me a conundrum that I will share with you. You may have heard it before. He said, how far can a person walk into the woods? The answer, of course, is only halfway, because after that, the person is walking out of the woods. So, and to me, this was the challenge for book arts addressing this type of collective tragedy, to determine when we're moving closer, when we're walking away, and what we as readers need to kind of bring to the picnic. So once again, well, actually not once again. So once, thank you to my fellow intern, Nama Zussman, to Corcoran Art and the Book Program Head, Carrie McAleer-Keeler, to Eric Fraser, is he here, who helped me so much, and most of all to the infinitely wise and endlessly patient Mark Dimunation. So thank you. And I should actually thank my husband too, who 30 hours ago was literally piloting his own propeller jet out of some mine in Australia so he could make it here. So thank you.
questions from the crowd, and then at a certain moment, I'm going to ask everyone sitting in front of the table when the questions end to grab your chair and move it out of the way. The new chairs can go over here, the folding chairs that way, so we can clear the table. Do you have questions for this fabulous person?
Julie, were you able to contact every single artist that has displayed work on this table that you selected? And if not, do you think the ones that you actually had personal interactions with about the pieces influenced your reading of them and also your more sensitivity towards those objects instead?
You know, that's a good question. I was not able to contact the author of Absence, and nor was I able to reach Barbara Farner.
The ones that you personally really had a connection to, like the last three, say, was it, do you think, also influenced by your conversations with them?
You know, I think it was a mix. I think it was a mix because there were certain books that I just genuinely felt such a strong attraction to, like 9 Nights. I was not able to contact the authors of that, and yet I just was so drawn to that book. I did have a much deeper appreciation for Michael Kutch's book after, talking with him about it, because we were really just, I had certain ideas about his book, and we were just very much on the same page, and so that happened to work out really well. But I love Werner Pfeiffer's book, but he didn't have a lot to share. So it was really a mix. It was really a mix. I mean, there were certain artists, and there were certain artists who were so generous with their time and with their insights, who I wasn't able to include them at all, and their books are out, but they just kind of didn't fit into the flow. So it was really just a mix.
She did a wonderful job of doing that, of tracking down the artists, but I have to say it's one of the advantages of bringing students to the Library of Congress, because a lot of these artists come through here themselves or not, or else we meet them through Joss. You actually introduced a speaker 2 years ago whose work was brought in with Joss, and it really is as simple as sometimes just terrifying the intern by saying, "You want to ask? You want to ask?"
Yeah.
Ask.
Right.
So it's not just a resource of books in this case; it's also connections to the artist.
Yes, I mean, Emily Martin was so generous and so gracious, but she mostly does pop-up books, and it just wasn't, and it didn't end up being the area I ended up exploring. So I would have loved to,
What I was trying to get at is it the strength of the book alone, or is it sometimes the insight, too, from the artist that sometimes forges a deeper connection, I guess?
Yeah.
It sounds like it's 50-50.
Yeah, I think it really was. It was.
Going on what Carrie just said, I was thinking that about the Maria Pisano book over there on the table, The Long Accordion, was that when she came to talk at the Corcoran to us about that book, I remember she had said she'd taken those photographs before they had, cordoned off, the site at the World Trade Center, and taken those photographs, sat with those photographs for years.
Yeah.
And what she said, though, was something floating up on a beach 10 years later, or some number of years later, that looked like that iconic structure we all know from 9/11, of that skeletal structure left from one of the buildings, that it floated up on the beach, and it was a similar piece of metal that she used to stencil that cover. And that's what triggered her to make the book. And that was such a powerful story that she couldn't figure out how to even begin the book till she was taking that walk years later, and organized the photos and the book to complete complete it, and it connected me to that book so much more than I think I would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
Hi, Julie. I really love the talk today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm curious that you delimited your field because it's such a massive field, but you didn't talk much about geopolitics today. And did you shy away from books that kind of got into nitty-gritty political stuff?
Yes and no. There were, there were a couple. The text of Werner Pfeiffer's book is actually, he doesn't really shy away from it. So, you could go ahead and read that. There were one or two that were really overtly political.
I mean, I go through the
and a
books
lot-
with the Alvin Street project. and
Right.
Some of them don't work because
Yeah.
because they get finger pointing both back to America and to.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the one I'm thinking of that I actually didn't even bring over here today, it was a very immediate. It was published in 2001, maybe early 2002. It's because it didn't even have like a moment of reflection. I think maybe even that author would publish something different today if she could. Hi.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Were most of the artists from New York, and
Really good
the
question.
ones that weren't, was
Mhm.
their approach to their work different? Did you find it
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I thought about weaving that in, but I just felt like it had gotten so long, that I'm like, okay, I need to leave some things out. Many of these artists were from New York, but not all of them. A lot of them, are kind of sometimes in New York, but somewhere else. It's interesting, Werner Pfeiffer was on the Brooklyn Bridge on his way into New York when the towers were attacked, and so that was his vantage point. Marshall Weber, who did 11, which is a book that you have to swirl around, he's a New Yorker. So many of these artists either live in New York or have a connection to New York. They like have a studio there, or they work there, or were, have some connection. It's interesting, Michael Kutch, who is not a New Yorker, and was not and although he is frequently in New York, he was not in New York, and so he watched on TV the attacks.
And his work seems more fantastical than, say,
Right, true, yeah. So, yes, yeah. So I imagine that's a whole other study. Although it's interesting, Werner Pfeiffer is one of the few in his text, he specifically talks about DC and Pennsylvania too, whereas a lot of these artists, even the non-New Yorkers, are just very focused on New York. So, even though, I mean, and when you look at his, he doesn't name all of the victims because there's not enough space. He says there's about half here, but I can't, maybe there are, I didn't count. But he specifically has people from, every flight, including the Pennsylvania flight and the Washington flight. So it's interesting because he's obviously at the towers, and that's obviously New York, but he is very kind of inclusive of the other locations as well.
Does that sound like a disservice to you that he is not including all the victims' names, or just about half? Does it make the other one seem somehow less important?
If I were a relative of one of the not included ones, would I feel, I wish that my loved one's name was there? But I guess this is, this is not that, right? This work is not that work.
Right, no.
This is, this is much more evocative. This is not supposed to be, and it's interesting, what he's actually done with these names is this is supposed to evoke what the towers look like. That's why they're in dark. Some of the names are in dark and some of the names are in light. And so, gee, can I say, well, gee, why isn't my loved one's name in bold? why is it in the lighter color? It's, I guess the top of the towers had like, I don't know, like ridges or something, and that, this is supposed to evoke.
It mimics
that.
the line that comes all the way down to the
Yeah.
pitch, the tuning fork at the end, at the bottom. The box for Kucha's does the same thing with lines.
Oh, right, that's right, yeah. You know, I kind of had that same initial thought, and I didn't really kind of think it all the way through, but, because it's not the point of this book.
One more, Nama?
Yeah. I actually think Michael Koch's work is very political in a very deceiving way, in his very sophisticated way. But I think it's interesting because I think from all the work that actually we have explored together, I think this is the most political work as far as I perceive. But I wanted to add something, but you mentioned the element of time, which I think is very essential and ingrained in the perception of all these array of works. And this is interesting because when you explore, when you experience, you can experience catharsis only when you are in a safe place, when you're far of the event, far of the turmoil. This was in a Greek tragedy, that you were in safe, you were part of the audience, and you could face this event from a distance. So a work, a fantastic work like a collective memory, which is the catharsis of the event, needed those 10 years of distance from the event to be able to be created. So
Yeah.
I think this is a very not only it's catharsis in itself, but it's also the catharsis of the whole the array of books in your talk.
Yeah, yeah, and this is really interesting, and I tried to put up a wide sampling of responses, and to put out a wide sampling of responses for anyone who is interested in that work, because for some people it's as if it happened yesterday, it could, and for other people can sort of take more of a historical look back. But like I said, I mean, 10 years in the course of history it's really not that much time, and people have, very strong views. So.
Okay, let's, Jeremy.
In doing this, did you ever look at or consider some of the material that had been collected in other divisions, such as the Prints and Photographs division, just to see the different approaches to?
I looked at just a few. Where I looked at one thing in Prints and Photographs, and I looked at Art Spiegelman's comic, and then there was so much material. I just had to narrow it down. But I mean, I know there's so much here at the library, and then there's so much, out in the world. But
just from the point of view of the immediacy of so much of the material in terms of the response, artistically, as opposed to the time it takes to actually literally make the book.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
Because I think a lot of the things that we collected at that time, we would probably wouldn't, or the artist wouldn't be as interested in doing it today. I just think, and I forget now, Sarah, the collection we collected with the things that were hanging on the.
Exeter did a similar thing immediately on 8 by 10, or 8 by 11.5 sheets of paper, and we have the entire collection.
Oh wow.
That was the one that was strung up in a gallery.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, that'd be an
And
interesting
some of the works
comparison,
are
wouldn't it?
exquisite, but most of them are,
Yeah. Right. Right.
But you're right, that also created a very moving experience. It was only a week later, I think, and you could walk through this cave of imagery.
Yeah, but it's a very It's a very different purpose. I think you're trying to do something very different, which is why it's almost unfair. I don't mean to harsh on Marshall Weber in that book. It's almost unfair to compare that book with the others that it was published immediately, and I didn't talk to him, so I don't know, if his intention really is to take you back to the eye of the hurricane, then that's what he does,
Actually, Marshall has produced more of the geopolitical material than most. All right, let's thank Julie again for that.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.